The security guard looked confused as he watched me pack the last box from what used to be the corner office on the 12th floor. "Miss Rodriguez, are you sure you don't want to take the plants too?" he asked, gesturing toward the thriving collection of succulents I'd carefully tended for over a decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I smiled, shaking my head as I sealed the box with tape that made a sharp final sound. "No thanks, Tom. Where I'm going, I won't need them." The confusion in his eyes deepened, but I couldn't blame him. After all, how could he possibly understand that this wasn't the end of my story at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions? It was just the beginning of Richard Blackwood's worst nightmare. As I walked past Stephanie Blackwood's new nameplate gleaming on what had been my office door just 3 days earlier, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine excitement. You see, while Richard thought he was getting rid of his biggest problem, he had actually just activated a clause in my contract that he'd forgotten existed. A clause that was about to turn his family business upside down and make me far wealthier than I'd ever imagined possible. I'm Natalie Rodriguez, 42 years old, and until last week, I was the Senior Creative Director at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions here in downtown Denver. For 15 years, I poured my heart, soul, and countless sleepless nights into building that company from a small startup with 12 employees into the premier marketing agency in Colorado, handling clients worth over $50 million annually. But apparently, loyalty and results mean nothing when nepotism comes knocking at your door. The whole ordeal started 3 months ago, though I didn't recognize the warning signs at first. Richard Blackwood, our CEO and the man who'd hired me fresh out of college, had been acting strangely during our weekly strategy meetings. Where he used to hang on every word of my campaign proposals and creative concepts, he seemed distracted, almost dismissive. I attributed it to stress. We just landed our biggest client ever, Morrison Automotive Group, and the pressure to deliver was immense. Looking back now, I realize Richard wasn't stressed about the workload. He was stressed about how to break the news that his daughter Stephanie, who had just graduated from business school with zero real-world experience, would be taking over my position. The same position I'd earned through 15 years of 70-hour work weeks, award-winning campaigns, and revenue growth that had made Richard a very wealthy man. My journey at Pinnacle began in September 2009, right after the economic recession had devastated most marketing firms. I was 27, carrying student loans that felt like a mortgage, and desperate for any opportunity to prove myself in an industry that was notoriously competitive. Richard had interviewed me in a coffee shop because the company couldn't even afford proper office furniture yet. He seemed genuinely impressed by my portfolio, but more importantly, he appeared to value fresh ideas and innovative thinking over traditional credentials. "Natalie," he'd said that day, stirring his black coffee with a wooden stick, "I'm not looking for someone who just executes orders. I need someone who can think like an owner, who understands that every dollar spent on marketing needs to return $3 in revenue. Are you that person?" Without hesitation, I told him yes. What I didn't know then was that my confident answer would eventually lead to the most important contract clause of my career. During those early days, Pinnacle operated out of a cramped suite in a converted warehouse. Richard, myself, and 10 other employees worked shoulder to shoulder, sharing ideas and resources like a true team. We took on clients that bigger agencies wouldn't touch: local restaurants, small tech startups, family-owned retailers, and we made magic happen with budgets that established firms would have laughed at. I threw myself into every project with the intensity of someone who knew this was my shot. While other employees clock-watched and left promptly at 5, I stayed late analyzing campaign performance, researching emerging digital trends, and developing strategies that consistently exceeded client expectations. Richard noticed this dedication, and within 18 months, he promoted me to creative manager with a salary increase that finally allowed me to move out of my studio apartment. The real breakthrough came in year 3, when I pitched an integrated social media campaign for a struggling outdoor gear company called Mountain Peak Adventures. Everyone thought the client was on the verge of bankruptcy, but I saw potential in their authentic brand story. My campaign focused on real customer adventures rather than polished stock photography, creating a community around the brand that felt genuine and inspiring. The results were extraordinary. Mountain Peak Adventures saw a 400% increase in online sales within 6 months, and their social media following grew from 3,000 to over 200,000 engaged followers. More importantly for Pinnacle, other outdoor and adventure brands started seeking us out specifically because of that campaign's success. Richard was so impressed that he called me into his office and said something I'll never forget. "Natalie, you've just secured our company's future. I want to make sure you're properly incentivized to stay with us long term." That conversation led to my contract renegotiation in year 4, and this is where the story gets interesting. Richard insisted on adding what he called a partnership appreciation clause to my employment agreement. The language was complex, drafted by his personal attorney Daniel Foster, but essentially it stated that if I remained with the company for at least 10 years, and was subsequently terminated without cause related to performance or misconduct, I would be entitled to a significant portion of the company's net worth calculated based on revenue growth during my tenure. At the time, Richard explained it as his way of ensuring I'd never want to leave for a competitor. "Think of it as a golden handcuff situation," he chuckled, "but instead of handcuffs, it's more like a golden parachute that gets better with time." The clause seemed almost too generous, specifying that my percentage would increase based on both years of service and measurable contributions to company growth. After 10 years, if I were ever terminated without just cause, I'd be entitled to 12% of the company's current valuation, plus additional percentages based on clients I'd personally acquired and campaigns I'd led that resulted in contract renewals. I signed the agreement without much thought about the termination clause because I never imagined Richard would let me go. We had become more than employer and employee, we were partners in building something special. He often said that Pinnacle's success was as much mine as his, and I believed him completely. The years that followed were the most rewarding of my career. I was promoted to Senior Creative Director in year 7, and my team grew to include 8 talented designers, copywriters and strategists. Together we won industry awards, earned recognition in marketing publications, and most importantly, we consistently delivered results that made our clients successful. Richard frequently praised my leadership in company meetings and at industry events, often introducing me as his secret weapon and the creative genius behind Pinnacle's growth. Our client roster expanded to include major Colorado businesses, tech companies, and eventually national brands, seeking our unique approach to authentic storytelling. I developed proprietary methodologies for measuring campaign effectiveness that other agencies tried to replicate, and I built relationships with clients that extended far beyond simple vendor arrangements. Many of them considered me their trusted advisor, and some had even followed me through multiple job changes at their own companies. Patricia Kim, our HR director who became both a mentor and close friend, often told me that Richard bragged about me constantly to his wife and friends. "He says you're the daughter he never had in business," she mentioned during one of our monthly coffee catch-ups. "He talks about succession planning and how you'll probably run this place someday." These conversations filled me with pride and a sense of security about my future at Pinnacle. The company culture Richard and I had built together was something special. We maintained the startup energy even as we grew, encouraging innovation and calculated risks. Employees felt valued and heard, turnover was remarkably low, and our reputation in Denver's business community was stellar. I genuinely loved coming to work each day, and I could see a clear path toward eventually becoming Richard's partner, or even succeeding him when he was ready to retire. Everything changed when Stephanie Blackwood graduated from Northwestern's business school in spring 2024. I'd met her a few times at company holiday parties over the years, a pleasant young woman who seemed bright but showed little interest in her father's business. She'd studied finance with plans to work in investment banking, and Richard had always respected her independence and different career ambitions. But something shifted during her final semester. Maybe it was the competitive job market, or perhaps she finally realized the value of what her father had built. But Stephanie suddenly expressed strong interest in joining Pinnacle. Richard was overjoyed, and honestly so was I initially. The idea of mentoring Richard's daughter and helping her develop her skills seemed like a natural extension of the family-like culture we'd created. My first real conversation with Stephanie happened during her spring break visit to the office. Richard had asked me to give her a comprehensive tour and explain our various service offerings. She seemed engaged and asked intelligent questions about our client relationships and creative processes. However, I noticed she spent an unusual amount of time inquiring about organizational structure, decision-making hierarchies, and financial performance metrics. "I'm trying to understand where I'd fit in here," she'd explained when I commented on her analytical approach. Dad's always said this place runs like a well-oiled machine, but I want to understand the actual mechanics. Her questions were thorough and thoughtful, though I did find it curious that she seemed more interested in management structure than creative strategy. When Richard announced in May that Stephanie would be joining us as a management trainee after graduation, the entire team was supportive. We'd grown accustomed to mentoring new hires, and having the boss's daughter learn from the ground up actually seemed like a positive sign about the company's values. I volunteered to include her in my team's projects and help her understand our creative development process. Stephanie started in July, and her first few weeks were completely normal. She was enthusiastic, asked good questions, and seemed genuinely interested in learning every aspect of our business. I assigned her to shadow different departments, work on small projects, and attend client meetings as an observer. She was particularly drawn to strategic planning sessions and financial performance reviews, which I attributed to her business school background. The first indication that something was amiss came during a staff meeting in late August. Richard was discussing our Q3 performance and upcoming goals when he made a comment that stopped me cold.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
As we look toward the future, we need to start thinking about leadership development and succession planning. Some of our senior staff have been here a long time, and we want to make sure we're building a sustainable management structure. His eyes didn't meet mine during this statement, which was unusual for Richard. We'd always maintain direct eye contact during meetings, especially when discussing strategic topics. Patricia noticed it too. I could see her subtle glance in my direction from across the conference table. After the meeting, I approached Richard privately to ask about his comments. "Are you concerned about something with my performance or leadership?" I asked directly. He seemed surprised by the question and assured me that everything was fine, attributing his comments to general business planning rather than any specific issues. But something in his tone felt rehearsed, as if he'd prepared for this exact question. September brought more subtle changes. Stephanie began attending meetings that had previously been limited to senior staff, and Richard started deferring to her opinions on matters where he traditionally valued my expertise. She'd offer suggestions that were often repackaged versions of strategies I'd developed, but Richard would respond with enthusiasm that felt disproportionate to the actual content of her ideas. More concerning was the way client relationships were being handled. Richard had always encouraged direct communication between me and our major clients, trusting my judgment on campaign adjustments and strategic pivots. But suddenly, he was insisting that all client communications flow through him first, explaining that he wanted to maintain consistent messaging across all accounts. Marcus Thompson, our financial controller, who'd become a trusted colleague over the years, started noticing irregularities too. "Natalie, have you seen the new reporting structure they want to implement?" he asked during a private conversation in October. "Stephanie's been asking for detailed breakdowns of which campaigns generated what revenue, and she wants it organized by team leader and project manager." This request seemed odd, because we'd always shared credit collectively as an agency. Our success was built on collaboration between departments, and individual attribution had never been a priority. When I asked Richard about the new reporting requirements, he explained that Stephanie was working on an MBA-style case study about integrated marketing effectiveness. The explanation seemed reasonable, but something about the timing felt calculated. The real turning point came in early November, when we landed the Morrison Automotive Group account. This was the biggest client in Pinnacle's history, a multi-year contract worth over $8 million annually. I'd been pursuing Morrison for almost 2 years, building relationships with their marketing team, and developing a comprehensive understanding of their brand challenges and opportunities. The pitch process had been intense, requiring custom campaign mock-ups, detailed ROI projections, and presentations to multiple stakeholder groups. My team worked evenings and weekends for 6 weeks preparing materials that showcased exactly why Pinnacle was the right choice for Morrison's national expansion strategy. When we won the account, Richard was ecstatic, calling it the achievement that would secure our company's position as Colorado's premier marketing agency. But instead of celebrating with the team who'd made it possible, Richard immediately began talking about how this success created new responsibilities and organizational challenges. "Managing an account this size requires a different level of strategic oversight," he announced during our victory meeting. We need to make sure we have the right leadership structure in place to handle Morrison's expectations. That phrase, the right leadership structure, sent a chill down my spine. It was corporate speak for changes that rarely benefited the people who'd actually generated the success being discussed. 2 weeks later, Richard called me into his office for what he described as a strategic planning conversation. Stephanie was there too, sitting in the chair I usually occupied during our meetings. Richard seemed nervous, as he began explaining that Pinnacle was entering a new phase of growth that required fresh perspective and innovative leadership approaches. "Natalie, you've built something incredible here," he began, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. "But sometimes success creates the need for evolution. Stephanie brings ideas about digital integration and data analytics that could take us to the next level." I listened carefully as he outlined a restructuring plan that essentially positioned Stephanie as senior creative director, while moving me to a newly created role called strategic consultant. The title sounded impressive, but the responsibilities were vague, and the reporting structure placed me firmly outside the decision-making hierarchy I'd helped build. "This isn't about your performance," Richard insisted when he saw my expression. "It's about positioning Pinnacle for the next decade of growth. Stephanie has fresh insights about Gen Z marketing and social media trends that our clients are demanding." The irony was almost laughable. I'd been pioneering social media marketing strategies since before Stephanie had even chosen her college major. The fresh insights Richard was referring to were variations of approaches I'd been refining for years. But pointing this out seemed futile, given the determination I saw in both their faces. I asked for time to consider the proposal, and Richard agreed to give me a week to think it over. That evening, I called Patricia Kim to discuss the situation. She'd been with Pinnacle almost as long as I had, and understood both the company culture and Richard's typical decision-making process. "Natalie, this doesn't sound like the Richard we know," she said after I explained the restructuring proposal. "In 15 years, I've never seen him make major organizational changes without extensive consultation and gradual implementation. Something else is driving this decision." Patricia's observation prompted me to do something I'd never done before. I started paying attention to the political undercurrents in our office. Over the next week, I noticed conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, email threads that I was mysteriously excluded from, and strategic discussions that somehow happened without my input. The most revealing moment came when I overheard Stephanie talking to someone on her cell phone in the break room. She was speaking quietly, but the acoustics carried her voice clearly. "Dad's finally ready to make the change. She's been here too long and gotten too comfortable. It's time for new blood, and honestly, it's time for family to take control of what we've built." That phrase, "what we've built," crystallized everything. Stephanie wasn't joining the company as a trainee, or even as a junior manager. She was positioning herself as the heir apparent, and my 15 years of contributions were being reframed as obstacles to the Blackwood family's destiny. The following Monday, I requested a meeting with Richard to discuss his proposal. I'd spent the weekend reviewing my contract and researching my options, including the partnership appreciation clause I'd signed years earlier. What I discovered was both surprising and empowering. The contract language was more favorable than I'd remembered, and the termination clause specifically protected against exactly the kind of restructuring Richard was proposing. If he moved forward with reducing my authority and responsibilities without cause related to performance or misconduct, it would legally constitute constructive dismissal under Colorado employment law. More importantly, the revenue growth during my tenure had been extraordinary. Pinnacle's annual revenue had increased from $2 million when I started to over $15 million currently. The partnership appreciation clause entitled me to 12% of current company valuation, plus additional percentages based on clients I'd acquired and retained. A conservative estimate put my potential settlement at well over $2 million. During our meeting, I presented Richard with a counter-proposal. Instead of accepting the strategic consultant role, I suggested that we formalize a true partnership arrangement that would give me equity in the company and a clear succession plan. This approach would allow Stephanie to learn the business gradually, while preserving the leadership structure that had driven our success. Richard's reaction told me everything I needed to know. He became visibly uncomfortable and defensive, insisting that partnership arrangements were too complicated and that the restructuring plan was non-negotiable. His tone shifted from collegial to authoritative, and for the first time in 15 years, it felt like an employee rather than a valued partner. "Natalie, you need to understand that this is my company," he said, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "I've built this business, and I have the right to structure it however I see fit. The offer on the table is generous considering your role moving forward." That statement was the final confirmation I needed. Richard wasn't interested in preserving our partnership or recognizing my contributions. He was clearing the path for his daughter's advancement, and my history with the company had become inconvenient rather than valuable. I thanked him for his time and said I'd provide my decision by the end of the week. But privately, I'd already decided on a different course of action. That afternoon, I contacted Daniel Foster, the attorney who drafted my original contract, to discuss my options and the potential value of my partnership appreciation clause. What I learned during that consultation changed everything. Not only was my contract ironclad in protecting against constructive dismissal, but Richard's proposed restructuring would trigger multiple clauses that significantly increased my settlement amount. The Morrison account alone, which I'd personally acquired and managed, added substantial value to my claim. "Natalie," Daniel explained during our meeting, "Richard either doesn't remember the terms of your contract, or he's gambling that you won't enforce them. Either way, you're in an extremely strong position if you choose to pursue this legally." The next few days were surreal. I continued working normally while privately preparing for what I knew would be the end of my time at Pinnacle. I documented my contributions to current campaigns, organized client files, and ensured that all my work would be properly transitioned regardless of what happened next. On Friday, I walked into Richard's office with my decision. Instead of accepting his restructuring proposal or negotiating further, I submitted my resignation letter and simultaneously provided notice that I was exercising my rights under the Partnership Appreciation Clause due to constructive dismissal. The look on Richard's face was a mixture of shock, confusion, and growing concern. "Natalie, what are you talking about? We offered you a position with the company." I calmly explained that reducing my responsibilities, authority, and client relationships without cause constituted constructive dismissal under both my contract and Colorado employment law. The Partnership Appreciation Clause was clear about my entitlements, and I intended to pursue them fully. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice rising. "That clause was just a formality. It was never meant to be used against the company." But that's exactly where Richard made his biggest mistake. The clause wasn't decorative language, it was a legally binding agreement that he'd insisted on including to keep me loyal to Pinnacle. Now that loyalty was being tested, and the contract was working exactly as designed, just not in the way he'd expected. Within an hour, Stephanie appeared in my office, looking flustered and concerned. "Natalie, Dad told me about your resignation. Surely we can work something out. This seems like a misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand." Her tone was conciliatory, but I could see the calculation behind her concern. If my partnership claim was successful, it would significantly impact the company's financial position and her inheritance prospects. What had seemed like a simple family succession plan was now a potential legal and financial nightmare. I explained to Stephanie that this wasn't a negotiating tactic or an emotional reaction to disappointment. The contract language was clear, and I intended to enforce my rights fully. After 15 years of building Pinnacle's success, I deserved fair compensation for my contributions, especially if that success was being used to justify my removal from leadership. That brings us back to the security guard watching me pack my office. 3 days had passed since my resignation, and Patricia Kim had helped me organize the transition of my responsibilities. Most of our team was confused and concerned about the sudden changes, and several key clients had already called asking about my departure. What Richard didn't realize as he watched me leave that day was that my strongest relationships were with the very clients who generated Pinnacle's highest revenue. Morrison Automotive Group, Mountain Peak Adventures, and 6 other major accounts had specific contract language allowing them to follow me if I left the agency. More importantly, these clients had grown to trust my strategic approach and weren't particularly interested in starting over with inexperienced leadership. As I sealed that final box in my former office, I wasn't just packing up 15 years of memories. I was preparing for the next chapter of a story that Richard thought was ending but was actually just beginning. The Partnership Appreciation Clause he'd forgotten about was about to become the most expensive mistake of his business career, and his daughter's inheritance was about to fund my new venture. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the phone call that changed everything, the client meeting that sealed Richard's fate, and how a forgotten contract clause turned into a $2 million payday. But first, you'll want to hear about what happened when Stephanie tried to handle the Morrison account on her own, and why Richard's simple family succession plan became the most complicated legal battle of his life. The best part, I hadn't even played my strongest card yet. The phone rang at exactly 8:30 Monday morning, 3 days after I'd walked out of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions with my career seemingly in ruins. I almost didn't answer because I was still in my pajamas, drowning my sorrows in coffee and contemplating whether 15 years of loyalty had been the biggest mistake of my professional life. The caller ID showed Morrison Automotive Group, and my heart immediately started racing. "Natalie, thank God I reached you," came the familiar voice of Jennifer Walsh, Morrison's chief marketing officer and the person I'd worked with for 2 years to secure their massive contract. "We just got the most bizarre email from someone named Stephanie Blackwood, claiming she's our new primary contact at Pinnacle. Please tell me this is some kind of administrative error." I took a deep breath, knowing this conversation would either validate my decision to leave or make me question everything I thought I knew about client relationships. "Jennifer, I'm afraid it's not an error. I resigned from Pinnacle last Friday due to some fundamental disagreements about the direction of the company." The silence on the other end lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Finally, Jennifer's voice returned, and she sounded genuinely distressed. "Natalie, you were the entire reason we chose Pinnacle over the 3 other agencies we considered. Your understanding of our brand, your strategic vision for our national expansion, the integrated campaign you developed. That was all you, not some company entity we can just transfer to a different person." What Jennifer said next changed the trajectory of everything that was about to unfold. "Our contract with Pinnacle includes a key personnel clause that specifically names you as the lead strategist. If you're no longer with the company, we have the right to terminate our agreement within 30 days without penalty. I'm not sure Pinnacle understands the implications of losing you." A key personnel clause. In all the chaos of the past week, I'd completely forgotten that Jennifer had insisted on including my name specifically in their service agreement. She'd been burned by another agency that had switched account teams mid-campaign, and she demanded contractual protection against that happening again. Richard had agreed to the clause because the Morrison contract was too valuable to lose over what seemed like a minor detail. "Jennifer, I appreciate your confidence in me more than you know," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I can't tell you what to do regarding your contract with Pinnacle, but I want you to know that I'm exploring options for continuing to serve clients who value our working relationship." "Are you saying you might start your own agency?" she asked, and I could hear the hope in her voice. "I'm saying that change creates opportunities, and I'm committed to making sure the clients who trusted me don't suffer because of internal politics at my former employer." We talked for another 20 minutes about the campaign timeline, upcoming deadlines, and her concerns about maintaining momentum with their national launch. By the end of the call, Jennifer had made her position crystal clear. Morrison Automotive Group wanted to work with me personally, not with Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. If I could provide comparable services through a different arrangement, they were prepared to exercise their termination clause immediately. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at my phone and realizing that Richard's plan to remove me had just created the opening I needed to turn this entire situation to my advantage. Not only did I have a potential wrongful termination case worth millions, but I also had Morrison, our biggest client, ready to follow me wherever I went. The second call came an hour later from David Martinez at Mountain Peak Adventures, the outdoor gear company that had been my first major success story at Pinnacle. "Natalie, I just heard through the industry grapevine that you're no longer with Pinnacle. Please tell me this isn't permanent, because you've been absolutely essential to our brand evolution over the past decade." David's call was followed by similar conversations with representatives from Summit Technology Solutions, Colorado Craft Brewery Alliance, and Elevation Real Estate Group. Each of these clients had specific concerns about continuity, and each had contractual language that provided escape clauses if key personnel changes occurred without their consent. By noon, I had a clearer picture of the disaster that Richard and Stephanie had unknowingly created. 7 of Pinnacle's 12 major clients had contracts that specifically named me or included key personnel protections. These clients represented approximately 60% of the company's annual revenue, and all of them were expressing serious concerns about the transition. More importantly, I was starting to see a path forward that could benefit everyone except Richard and his daughter. If I moved quickly to establish my own agency, I could potentially serve these clients directly while pursuing my contractual claims against Pinnacle. The wrongful termination settlement would provide startup capital, and the client relationships would provide immediate revenue. That afternoon, I called Patricia Kim to discuss what I was learning about client reactions. As HR director, she was fielding calls from confused clients and increasingly frustrated employees who didn't understand why their most successful colleague had suddenly disappeared. "Natalie, it's been absolute chaos here since Friday," Patricia admitted during our coffee meeting at a downtown cafe far from Pinnacle's offices. "Richard and Stephanie are scrambling to manage client relationships they don't understand, and half the creative team is asking me about opportunities elsewhere." Patricia had always been more than just an HR professional. She understood the business implications of personnel decisions and had often served as Richard's advisor on strategic matters. Her perspective on the current situation was both validating and alarming. "I've been with this company for 12 years, and I've never seen Richard make such a poorly planned decision," she continued. "He seems to think that clients hire agencies as corporate entities, but you and I both know they hire people. They hire expertise, relationships, and trust. You can't just substitute one person for another and expect the same results." What Patricia told me next was even more concerning from Richard's perspective. "Stephanie has been asking me for detailed client files, campaign performance data, and strategic documents for accounts she's never worked on." When I explained that much of the institutional knowledge about these relationships exists in people's heads rather than in files, she seemed genuinely surprised. This revealed the fundamental flaw in Richard's succession planning. He'd assumed that transferring my title to his daughter would automatically transfer my relationships, expertise, and strategic understanding. But 15 years of client development couldn't be downloaded like a computer file. "There's something else you should know," Patricia added, lowering her voice even though we were sitting in a crowded cafe. "Richard hired an employment attorney last Friday afternoon, right after you submitted your resignation letter. He's clearly concerned about your contract claims, but I think he's underestimating the full scope of what he's triggered." The employment attorney was an interesting detail because it suggested that Richard wasn't as confident about his legal position as he'd appeared during our confrontation. If the partnership appreciation clause was as meaningless as he'd claimed, why would he need immediate legal counsel? Over the weekend, I'd been researching employment law and consulting with Daniel Foster about the strength of my claims. What I'd learned was that Colorado had particularly strong protections against constructive dismissal, and my contract language was unusually favorable to the employee. More importantly, the revenue growth during my tenure created a potential settlement value that far exceeded what most wrongful termination cases could achieve. "Patricia, I need to ask you something in confidence," I said, making sure no one was within earshot. "In your professional opinion, did Richard plan this transition properly? Did he consider the legal implications, the client impact, or the financial risks?" Patricia shook her head with a rueful smile. "Honestly, Natalie, I think Richard got caught up in the idea of bringing his daughter into the business and didn't think through the consequences. He's been successful for so long that I don't think he considered the possibility that removing you could backfire this badly." That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for Richard to realize his mistake, or hoping that client pressure would force him to reconsider, I decided to move forward with establishing my own agency, while simultaneously pursuing my contractual claims against Pinnacle. The first step was securing legal representation for the wrongful termination case. Daniel Foster had drafted my original contract, but I needed someone who specialized in employment litigation and had experience with complex settlement negotiations. Through my network of business contacts, I found Caroline Webb, a partner at Denver's most prestigious employment law firm, who had a reputation for achieving exceptional results in executive-level disputes. Caroline's initial assessment of my case was even more optimistic than I'd hoped. "Natalie, this is one of the strongest wrongful termination cases I've seen in 20 years of practice," she explained during our consultation. "The partnership appreciation clause alone creates a potential settlement in the high six figures, but when you add the constructive dismissal claim and the damage to your professional reputation, we're looking at a much larger number." More importantly, Caroline understood the business implications of my situation. "The fact that major clients are prepared to leave Pinnacle because of your departure actually strengthens your position significantly. It demonstrates the concrete value of your contributions and the real harm the company will suffer as a result of their decision." While Caroline began preparing the legal foundation for my claims against Pinnacle, I started developing a business plan for Rodriguez Marketing Solutions. The name was simple and direct, reflecting my intention to build a company based on personal relationships and strategic expertise rather than corporate bureaucracy. The second week after my departure from Pinnacle was when Richard finally began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. According to Patricia, who continued to update me on the internal chaos, Morrison Automotive Group had formally notified Pinnacle of their intent to terminate their contract due to key personnel changes. Richard went completely pale when he got that letter, Patricia told me during another discreet coffee meeting. He kept asking Stephanie how this was possible, as if she should somehow know the details of a contract she'd never read. The Morrison termination notice was followed by similar communications from 4 other major clients, all citing key personnel clauses or expressing no confidence in service continuity under new leadership. Within 10 days of my departure, Pinnacle was facing the potential loss of over $8 million in annual revenue. Stephanie, who had been so confident about her ability to manage these accounts, was discovering that client relationships couldn't be inherited like family heirlooms. Her MBA training had prepared her for financial analysis and strategic planning, but it hadn't taught her how to navigate the personal dynamics that drive successful marketing partnerships. The worst part is watching her try to apply business school frameworks to situations that require intuition and experience, Patricia observed. She keeps asking clients about their pain points and value propositions when what they really want is someone who understands their business well enough to anticipate problems before they happen. Meanwhile, I was making rapid progress on establishing my new agency. Jennifer Walsh at Morrison had introduced me to 2 other marketing executives who were dissatisfied with their current agencies, and word was spreading through Denver's business community that I was available for new client relationships. The timing couldn't have been better. Several companies had been watching Pinnacle's success and wondering if they could access similar results, but they'd been hesitant to switch agencies while I was unavailable. Now that I was establishing my own firm, these prospects became immediate opportunities. By the end of my second week of independence, I had verbal commitments from 5 clients representing over $6 million in annual billings. Morrison Automotive Group was prepared to transfer their entire account once their Pinnacle termination became effective, and 3 other companies were ready to sign contracts immediately. The financial projections for Rodriguez Marketing Solutions were exceeding my most optimistic expectations. With lower overhead than a traditional agency and higher value client relationships, I could potentially achieve greater profitability in my first year than Pinnacle had ever accomplished. But the most satisfying development was watching Richard scramble to understand what had gone wrong with his succession plan. According to Patricia, he'd been calling emergency meetings with his remaining staff, consulting with multiple attorneys, and desperately trying to convince departing clients to reconsider their decisions. He finally asked me yesterday if I thought you might be willing to come back, Patricia revealed with obvious amusement. When I told him that ship had sailed, he wanted to know if there was any way to minimize the legal exposure from your contract claims. Richard's belated recognition of his mistake was gratifying, but it was too late to change the trajectory of events he'd set in motion. My wrongful termination case was proceeding exactly as Caroline had predicted, and my new agency was attracting exactly the type of clients I'd always wanted to serve. The third week brought news that confirmed just how devastating Richard's decision had been for Pinnacle. Marcus Thompson, the financial controller who'd been one of my closest colleagues, called to tell me that the company was facing serious cash flow problems as clients departed and new business development stalled. Natalie, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I think you should know that Richard has been forced to take out a significant loan to cover operating expenses, Marcus confided. Losing Morrison and the other major accounts has created a financial crisis that he didn't anticipate. The cash flow problems were compounded by Pinnacle's fixed overhead costs, which had been calculated based on revenue from clients who were no longer paying their bills. Richard had built his business model around retaining major accounts for multiple years, and the sudden departure of so many key clients had exposed the vulnerability of that approach. More troubling for Richard was the realization that replacing departed clients wouldn't be as simple as he'd assumed. The reputation and relationships that had driven Pinnacle's growth were largely tied to my personal brand within Denver's business community. Without that foundation, the company was struggling to differentiate itself from dozens of other marketing agencies competing for the same prospects. Stephanie's inexperience was becoming more apparent with each client interaction. Several prospects had mentioned to me that they'd met with her and came away unimpressed with her understanding of their industries and strategic challenges. The confidence that had carried her through business school wasn't translating to real-world client development. She keeps talking about synergistic solutions and integrated value propositions without demonstrating any actual understanding of what those phrases mean in practice, one prospect told me after meeting with both agencies. It was like listening to a business school textbook rather than talking to someone who could actually help solve our problems. Meanwhile, my legal case against Pinnacle was progressing better than Caroline had initially projected. Richard's attorneys had requested settlement discussions, which indicated they understood the strength of my position and wanted to avoid the public exposure of a trial. They're clearly concerned about the partnership appreciation clause, Caroline explained during one of our strategy sessions. Their initial settlement offer was significantly higher than typical wrongful termination cases, which tells me they've calculated the potential exposure and want to minimize it. The settlement negotiations revealed just how valuable my contributions to Pinnacle had been in concrete financial terms. Caroline's forensic accountant had analyzed the company's growth during my tenure and determined that my personal efforts had generated over $40 million in cumulative revenue. The partnership appreciation clause entitled me to a percentage of current company value based on that contribution, creating a potential settlement well into seven figures. But Richard's biggest problem wasn't the money he might owe me, it was the ongoing damage to his business from my departure. Every week that passed brought new client defections, reduced revenue, and increased financial pressure. The succession plan that was supposed to secure his family's future was instead threatening to destroy everything he'd built. As I sat in my temporary office space, reviewing contracts for 3 new clients and preparing for a settlement conference that could make me financially independent, I couldn't help but marvel at how completely Richard had misunderstood the situation. He'd assumed that removing me would clear the path for his daughter's advancement, but instead he'd triggered a chain of events that was systematically dismantling his company's competitive position. The most ironic part was that none of this had been necessary. If Richard had approached me about mentoring Stephanie, developing a genuine succession plan, or even offering me equity in exchange for training his daughter, I would have been enthusiastic about helping. The partnership I'd hoped for could have benefited everyone while preserving the client relationships and institutional knowledge that made Pinnacle successful. Instead, his assumption that I was expendable had created the very situation he'd been trying to avoid. Pinnacle was losing its competitive edge, Stephanie was struggling with responsibilities she wasn't prepared for, and Richard was facing financial obligations that could cripple his business for years to come. But the story was far from over. The settlement conference was scheduled for the following week, and I had reason to believe that Richard was finally beginning to understand the full scope of what his decision was going to cost him. What he didn't know yet was that I had one more card to play. Information that would make his situation even more complicated than he realized. The settlement conference was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, but the call that changed everything came Monday evening while I was reviewing financial projections for Rodriguez Marketing Solutions. The caller ID showed Victor Chen, Pinnacle's IT manager, and I almost didn't answer because we'd never had much direct interaction during my time at the company. "Natalie, I'm sorry to call so late, but I need to talk to someone I trust." Victor's voice was shaky and I could hear genuine distress in his tone. "Something really strange is happening here, and I think you should know about it before your meeting tomorrow." Victor had always been the quiet, methodical type who kept Pinnacle's technology infrastructure running smoothly without drawing attention to himself. For him to reach out directly suggested something serious was developing, and his timing indicated it was connected to my legal case. "What's going on, Victor?" I asked, settling into my chair and preparing for what sounded like it might be a significant revelation. "Richard asked me to do something today that doesn't make sense from a technical standpoint but makes perfect sense if someone is trying to hide information," he began carefully. "He wants me to perform a complete server migration and archive deletion for all files older than 6 months. He claims it's for storage optimization, but we have plenty of server capacity." The implications of what Victor was describing hit me immediately. A comprehensive archive deletion just days before a major settlement conference wasn't about storage management, it was about evidence destruction. Richard was apparently trying to eliminate records that might support my claims about revenue generation, client development, and strategic contributions. "Victor, did he give you any specific instructions about which files to prioritize for deletion?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral while my mind raced through the legal implications. "That's the weird part," Victor continued. "He specifically mentioned email archives, client communication records, and project files from campaigns you led. He said these older files were cluttering the system and making it harder for Stephanie to access current information. What Richard didn't understand was that Victor Chen had an engineering degree and 12 years of experience managing corporate IT systems. He recognized the difference between legitimate system maintenance and suspicious data manipulation, and he was clearly uncomfortable with what he was being asked to do. Natalie, I've been thinking about this all day, and I can't shake the feeling that something unethical is happening, Victor admitted. Those archived files contain documentation of every major campaign success, client acquisition, and strategic initiative from the past several years. Deleting them right before your settlement meeting seems like more than a coincidence. Victor's call presented me with a critical decision. I could simply document his information and use it to strengthen my legal position, or I could ask him to take a more active role in preserving evidence that Richard was apparently trying to destroy. Either approach carried risks, but the potential value of those archived files could be enormous. Victor, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer, I said, choosing my words deliberately. Are you calling me as a friend who's concerned about what's happening, or are you calling because you think what you're being asked to do might be wrong? The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds, and I could almost hear Victor weighing the implications of his response. Finally, he spoke with a clarity that surprised me. I'm calling because 15 years of your work shouldn't disappear to make someone else's legal problems go away. That's not right, regardless of company politics or family succession plans. Victor's moral clarity gave me the opening I needed to ask for his help in preserving evidence that could be crucial to my case. If you're comfortable with it, I'd like to put you in touch with my attorney. She might have suggestions for how to handle Richard's request in a way that protects both the company's legitimate interests and ensures that important business records aren't inappropriately destroyed. That evening, I arranged a conference call between Victor, Caroline Webb, and myself to discuss the legal implications of Richard's archive deletion request. Caroline's reaction was immediate and unequivocal. What Richard was proposing constituted potential evidence tampering that could significantly increase my settlement value and possibly result in criminal charges. This is exactly the kind of behavior that transforms a civil employment dispute into something much more serious. Caroline explained to Victor, courts take a very dim view of evidence destruction, especially when it occurs after litigation has been initiated. Caroline's advice to Victor was straightforward but carefully considered. As an employee, he couldn't refuse a direct order from his supervisor without risking his own job. However, he could document the request thoroughly, implement it in a way that preserved backup copies of critical files, and ensure that his actions were fully compliant with Colorado's evidence preservation laws. Victor, you're in a difficult position, but you also have an opportunity to protect yourself and ensure that important business records aren't lost. I'd recommend implementing Richard's request exactly as specified, but maintaining secure backup copies of any files that document the company's revenue growth, client relationships, or strategic planning during Natalie's tenure. The next morning, I arrived at Caroline's law offices 45 minutes before the scheduled settlement conference, feeling more confident about my position than I had since this entire situation began. Richard's apparent attempt to destroy evidence had not only strengthened my legal claims but also revealed just how worried he was about the potential exposure from my partnership appreciation clause. Caroline had prepared meticulously for the negotiation, with detailed financial analysis of Pinnacle's growth during my tenure, documentation of my contributions to client acquisition and retention, and now evidence of Richard's questionable behavior regarding company records. The case that had started as a straightforward wrongful termination claim had evolved into something much more comprehensive. Natalie, Richard's legal team, called this morning to request a 30-minute delay, Caroline informed me as we reviewed our negotiation strategy. They cited scheduling conflicts, but I suspect they're dealing with internal issues related to the information Victor provided yesterday. When Richard finally arrived with his attorney, the change in his demeanor was immediately apparent. The confident businessman who had dismissed my contract claims just 2 weeks earlier now looked genuinely worried, and his attorney seemed to be doing most of the talking during their private consultations. The settlement conference began with standard procedural discussions, but the real drama started when Caroline presented our evidence of Pinnacle's attempts to delete archived files that were relevant to my claims. Richard's attorney looked genuinely surprised by this information, which suggested that Richard had acted without proper legal counsel. Mr. Blackwood, did you instruct your IT staff to delete archived company files within the past week? Caroline asked directly, her tone professional but pointed. Richard's response was evasive and unconvincing. He claimed that the archive deletion was routine system maintenance that had been planned for months, but he couldn't provide any documentation of that planning or explain why it coincidentally occurred just before our settlement conference. More damaging to Richard's credibility was his inability to explain why the deletion specifically targeted files from campaigns I had led. When Caroline pressed him on this point, his attorney intervened and requested a private consultation, effectively confirming that they recognized the legal implications of his actions. During the break in negotiations, Caroline and I discussed the dramatic shift in leverage that had occurred overnight. Richard's behavior has essentially proven our case for us, she observed. No one destroys evidence unless they're afraid of what it might reveal, and his actions suggest that he knows exactly how valuable your contributions were to the company. When negotiations resumed, Richard's legal team presented a settlement offer that was substantially higher than their initial proposal but still significantly below what Caroline believed my claims were worth. The offer included financial compensation, a confidentiality agreement, and a mutual non-disparagement clause that would prevent either party from discussing the settlement publicly. Caroline's counter-proposal was aggressive but well supported by the evidence we'd assembled. We demanded full compensation under the Partnership Appreciation Clause, additional damages for constructive dismissal and reputational harm, and punitive damages related to the evidence destruction. The total amount was more than twice Richard's offer and represented a significant percentage of Pinnacle's total value. Your client's attempts to destroy relevant business records have fundamentally changed the nature of this dispute, Caroline informed Richard's attorney. We're no longer discussing a simple employment separation, we're now addressing potential misconduct that could result in criminal charges if this matter proceeds to court. The threat of criminal exposure was clearly something Richard hadn't anticipated, and his attorney requested another recess to discuss their options privately. During this break, I couldn't help but reflect on how completely the situation had reversed from just 3 weeks earlier. Richard had initiated this conflict believing that he could simply replace me with his daughter and avoid any significant consequences. His assumption that my contract was meaningless and my contributions were easily replaceable had led him to make increasingly desperate decisions that only strengthened my position. When negotiations resumed after lunch, Richard's team presented a revised offer that came much closer to our demands. The financial settlement was substantial enough to provide complete security for my future, and the terms included acknowledgement of my contributions to Pinnacle's success without requiring me to sign an overly restrictive confidentiality agreement. But I wasn't quite ready to accept their offer because I had one more piece of information that could significantly increase the settlement value. During my research into Pinnacle's client contracts, I had discovered something that Richard apparently didn't realize. Several major clients had penalty clauses that required them to pay significant fees if they terminated their agreements without proper cause. These penalty clauses had been Richard's insurance against clients leaving for minor reasons, but they created a substantial liability if clients departed due to key personnel changes that constituted breach of service agreements. Morrison Automotive Group alone could claim damages of over $800,000 if they could prove that Pinnacle had failed to maintain agreed-upon staffing levels. Caroline, I think we need to discuss the client penalty exposure with Richard's team, I suggested during a break in negotiations. He may not realize that his decision to remove me has triggered liability clauses in several major contracts. Caroline's research into this issue revealed that Pinnacle potentially faced over $2 million in client penalty claims related to my departure. These penalties were separate from the revenue loss the company was experiencing, and they represented immediate financial obligations that could seriously threaten Pinnacle's solvency. When we presented this information to Richard's legal team, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Richard himself became visibly agitated, repeatedly asking his attorney how this was possible and why no one had warned him about these potential liabilities.
Mr. Blackwood, did you review your client contracts before making the decision to restructure Miss Rodriguez's position? Caroline asked pointedly. Richard's admission that he had not thoroughly reviewed client agreements before removing me from my role was the final confirmation that his decision had been impulsive rather than strategic. His assumption that clients would simply accept whatever staffing changes he implemented had exposed his company to financial obligations that far exceeded anything he had anticipated. The final settlement negotiations took place in an atmosphere of barely controlled panic from Richard's side. His attorney was clearly concerned about the cumulative exposure from my wrongful termination claims, potential client penalties, and ongoing revenue losses from departed accounts. Richard himself seemed to finally understand that his simple family succession plan had become a complex legal and financial disaster that threatened to destroy everything he had built over 20 years. His daughter's inheritance, which had motivated his original decision to remove me, was now at risk because of the very actions he had taken to protect it. The settlement we ultimately reached exceeded even Caroline's most optimistic projections. In addition to full compensation under the Partnership Appreciation Clause, Richard agreed to pay substantial additional damages for constructive dismissal, reputational harm, and the business disruption caused by his attempt to destroy evidence. The total settlement amount was sufficient to fund Rodriguez Marketing Solutions for several years while providing complete financial security for my future. More importantly, the agreement included acknowledgement that my departure had caused significant harm to Pinnacle's business, effectively validating everything I had claimed about my value to the company. But the most satisfying aspect of the settlement was Richard's agreement to publicly acknowledge my contributions to Pinnacle's success and to provide positive references for my new business endeavors. This provision would help counteract any damage to my professional reputation and signal to the business community that my departure had been Richard's mistake rather than any failing on my part. As I signed the settlement documents, I couldn't help but think about how different things could have been if Richard had approached the succession planning process with wisdom rather than arrogance. If he had offered me equity, developed a genuine partnership with his daughter, or simply treated me with the respect my contributions deserved, none of this legal drama would have been necessary. Instead, his assumption that I was expendable had triggered a series of events that cost him far more than any partnership arrangement would have required. The settlement amount alone exceeded what he probably would have paid me in equity distributions over several years, and that didn't account for the ongoing damage to his business from client departures and reputational harm. Walking out of Caroline's offices that afternoon with a signed settlement agreement worth over $3 million, I felt a sense of vindication that had nothing to do with money. Richard's recognition of my value, forced though it was by legal pressure, represented validation of 15 years of dedication and excellence that he had tried to dismiss as easily replaceable. But more than personal vindication, the settlement represented the foundation for building something better than what I had left behind at Pinnacle. Rodriguez Marketing Solutions would be structured as the true partnership that Richard had never been willing to offer, with equity participation for key employees and a culture that valued loyalty and contribution over politics and nepotism. The irony was that Richard's attempt to clear the path for his daughter's advancement had instead funded the creation of his most formidable competitor. The clients who had left Pinnacle were already signing contracts with my new agency, and the settlement money would allow me to hire the best talent and invest in capabilities that could quickly surpass what Pinnacle had ever achieved. As I drove home that evening, I received a text message from Jennifer Walsh at Morrison Automotive Group confirming that their legal team had finalized the termination of their Pinnacle contract and approving the transfer of their account to Rodriguez Marketing Solutions. Similar confirmations arrived throughout the week from other clients who had been waiting for the legal situation to resolve before making their moves official. Within a month of the settlement, Rodriguez Marketing Solutions had signed contracts representing over $12 million in annual billings, making it one of the fastest-growing marketing agencies in Colorado history. The success was gratifying professionally, but what I enjoyed most was building a company culture based on the values that Richard had abandoned in favor of family politics. The final piece of irony came 6 months later, when Patricia Kim called to tell me that Stephanie had resigned from Pinnacle to pursue opportunities elsewhere. Apparently, the pressure of trying to manage client relationships she didn't understand, combined with the financial stress of the departed accounts, had made her position untenable. She finally realized that inheriting a business is different from earning leadership of one, Patricia observed during our conversation. I think she gained some appreciation for what you had accomplished here, even if it came too late to matter. Richard's grand plan to hand over a thriving business to his daughter had instead left him with a struggling company, massive legal bills, and the knowledge that his own poor judgment had created the very situation he had tried to avoid. The daughter he had wanted to elevate was gone, the employee he had dismissed was thriving, and the business he had built was a shadow of its former success. But the real lesson of this entire experience wasn't about revenge or vindication, it was about the importance of recognizing and respecting the contributions that make success possible. Richard's failure wasn't just tactical, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of what creates value in a professional services business. The relationships, expertise, and trust that I had developed over 15 years couldn't be transferred to someone else like inherited property. They had to be earned through demonstrated competence, genuine care for client success, and the kind of long-term thinking that Richard had abandoned when he prioritized family politics over business wisdom. As Rodriguez Marketing Solutions continued to grow and prosper, I made sure that every employee understood their value to our collective success and had a genuine pathway to participate in the prosperity they helped create. The partnership appreciation clause that had seemed like such a clever retention tool when Richard first proposed it became the model for how I structured ownership opportunities throughout my new organization. The difference was that I meant it sincerely, while Richard had apparently viewed it as a meaningless formality that would never be tested. That fundamental difference in perspective, between viewing employees as partners versus viewing them as replaceable resources, had ultimately determined the outcome of this entire conflict. The anonymous letter arrived at my office 6 months after the settlement, delivered by courier with no return address and postmarked from somewhere outside Colorado. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message that would fundamentally change how I understood everything that had happened at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. Natalie, you deserve to know the truth about why Richard really removed you from your position. The succession plan was never about Stephanie's qualifications or business vision. Richard discovered information about your background that he believed made you a liability to the company's future. He was wrong about what he found, but his reaction explains why he acted so irrationally. Check the Morrison contract negotiations from 18 months ago. Look at the communications between Richard and their legal team about the key personnel clause. There's something there that Richard never told you. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting looked familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. Someone with inside knowledge of Pinnacle's operations had decided I needed to understand the real motivation behind Richard's behavior, and they clearly believed that information would matter to me. My first instinct was to ignore the letter entirely. The settlement had provided closure, my new business was thriving, and revisiting the past seemed unnecessarily painful. But something about the specific reference to the Morrison contract negotiations nagged at me throughout the day. The Morrison account had been the crown jewel of my career at Pinnacle, representing not just the largest client I'd ever secured, but also the most complex negotiation process I'd ever managed. The key personnel clause that Jennifer Walsh had insisted on including had seemed like a minor detail at the time, but it had proven crucial to my ability to transition those relationships to Rodriguez Marketing Solutions. That evening I called Daniel Foster, the attorney who had originally drafted my Pinnacle contract, and who had maintained copies of various business documents related to my employment. If there were communications between Richard and Morrison's legal team that I hadn't seen, Daniel might have access to them through his ongoing relationship with Pinnacle's legal affairs. Natalie, that's an interesting request, Daniel said after I explained what I was looking for. I don't typically maintain copies of client negotiation records unless they relate directly to employment agreements, but let me check my files from that time period. Daniel called back 3 days later with information that initially seemed routine, but gradually revealed something much more significant. I found the correspondence you asked about, and there are definitely some communications between Richard and Morrison's attorneys that seem unusual in retrospect. What Daniel had discovered was a series of emails between Richard and Morrison's legal counsel, discussing the key personnel clause that Jennifer Walsh had requested. The communications revealed that Morrison's attorneys had conducted a background investigation on me as part of their due diligence process, which was standard practice for major client relationships. But buried in those emails was a reference to something that had apparently alarmed Richard significantly. Morrison's investigators had uncovered information about my college internship at a marketing firm that had subsequently been involved in a scandal related to misleading advertising practices. The firm had been fined by the Federal Trade Commission 3 years after I had left to join Pinnacle, but my name appeared in some of the background documentation because I had worked on campaigns that were later scrutinized. Richard's reaction to this information was completely disproportionate to its actual significance. Daniel explained as he walked me through the correspondence. The scandal had nothing to do with your work, occurred years after you left the company, and involved practices that you had no knowledge of or involvement in. However, Richard's emails to Morrison's legal team revealed a man who was genuinely panicked about potential reputational risks to Pinnacle. He had apparently spent weeks researching the FTC case, consulting with multiple attorneys, and convincing himself that my past association with the disgraced firm represented a serious liability for any client relationships I managed. The most revealing email was one Richard had sent to Morrison's general counsel explaining why Pinnacle was transitioning account leadership to ensure the highest standards of compliance and risk management. He had essentially informed Morrison that I would be removed from their account for reasons related to regulatory concerns, without ever discussing these concerns with me directly. Morrison's response to Richard's email was both professional and pointed. Their general counsel had written back explaining that their investigation had found no evidence of any wrongdoing on my part, that the FTC case was unrelated to my work or conduct, and that they had full confidence in my integrity and capabilities. More importantly, they had explicitly stated that any attempt to remove me from their account would result in contract termination. Natalie, this correspondence completely changes the context of everything that happened subsequently, Daniel observed. Richard wasn't making a strategic decision about succession planning, he was reacting to perceived risks that didn't actually exist, and he was apparently too embarrassed about his mistake to admit what had motivated his actions. The revelation that Richard's behavior had been driven by an irrational fear of regulatory exposure, rather than genuine business strategy, explained so many aspects of the situation that had never made sense. His refusal to discuss his reasoning, his insistence on immediate implementation of the succession plan, and his apparent desperation to justify his decisions all stemmed from his realization that he had misinterpreted harmless background information as a serious threat. More troubling was the realization that Richard had communicated concerns about my integrity to major clients without ever giving me an opportunity to address or even understand those concerns. His behind-the-scenes efforts to manage what he perceived as a crisis had actually created the very problems he was trying to avoid. I spent the weekend processing this information and trying to understand how it affected my perspective on everything that had transpired. Part of me was angry that Richard had questioned my integrity based on such flimsy evidence, but another part was almost relieved to finally understand why a man I had considered a mentor and partner had suddenly treated me as a liability. Monday morning brought a phone call that provided even more context for Richard's behavior. Marcus Thompson, the former Pinnacle financial controller who had become a friend during our years working together, called with information that he felt I deserved to know. Natalie, I've been debating whether to tell you this for months, but I think you should understand what was really happening during those last few weeks before you left, Marcus began. Richard had been consulting with employment attorneys about how to terminate you without triggering your contract clauses almost 3 months before he actually made his move. Marcus explained that Richard had been researching termination for cause scenarios that might allow him to avoid the partnership appreciation clause entirely. He had apparently been looking for any evidence of performance issues, policy violations, or other grounds that would justify dismissal without the financial consequences of wrongful termination. The problem was that your performance record was flawless, and you'd never violated any company policies, Marcus continued. Richard's attorneys apparently told him that constructive dismissal through restructuring was his only option if he was determined to remove you from the company. This information confirmed that Richard's actions had been premeditated and calculated rather than impulsive reactions to immediate circumstances. He had spent months planning my removal, and had chosen the most legally risky approach because he couldn't find legitimate grounds for termination. The irony was that if Richard had simply shared his concerns about the FTC case with me directly, we could have addressed them easily and maintained our working relationship. The background information that had so alarmed him was a matter of public record that any competent attorney could have explained and dismissed as irrelevant to current business operations. Instead, his decision to act secretly and unilaterally had created exactly the kind of legal and financial exposure he had been trying to avoid. His fear of a theoretical regulatory risk had led him to take actions that resulted in actual legal liability worth millions of dollars. That afternoon, I decided to reach out to Jennifer Walsh at Morrison Automotive Group to discuss what I had learned about Richard's communications with their legal team. Jennifer had become more than just a client during our transition to Rodriguez Marketing Solutions. She had become a trusted advisor and friend who understood the business implications of the entire Pinnacle situation. Natalie, I'm not surprised by what you're telling me, Jennifer said after I explained the background investigation and Richard's reaction to it. Our legal team mentioned that Richard seemed unusually anxious about compliance issues during the contract negotiations, but we attributed it to normal corporate caution. Jennifer went on to explain that Morrison's attorneys had actually been impressed by the thoroughness of my background and had specifically noted my lack of involvement in any questionable business practices. Your reputation for ethical conduct was one of the reasons we felt comfortable including the key personnel clause in our contract, she added. The conversation with Jennifer helped me understand that Richard's fears had been not only unfounded but actually contradicted by the very investigation that had triggered them. Morrison's legal team had concluded that I represented lower regulatory risk than typical agency personnel, not higher risk as Richard had apparently believed. More significantly, Jennifer revealed that Morrison had received similar communications from Richard about other Pinnacle employees, suggesting that his paranoia about regulatory exposure had extended beyond just my situation. He seemed to be conducting some kind of internal audit of staff backgrounds that went far beyond normal compliance procedures, she observed. This pattern of behavior suggested that Richard's decision to remove me was part of a broader panic about potential liability rather than a strategic succession plan. His actions appeared to be driven by fear and misunderstanding rather than rational business planning. The following week brought another revelation that further clarified Richard's motivations. Patricia Kim called to tell me that she had decided to leave Pinnacle and was preparing to submit her resignation. During our conversation, she shared information that helped explain the timeline of Richard's decision-making process. Natalie, I probably should have told you this months ago, but Richard had been asking me to research employment law procedures for removing senior staff without cause, Patricia revealed. He claimed he was updating company policies, but the timing coincided exactly with the Morrison contract negotiations. Patricia explained that Richard had specifically asked about constructive dismissal scenarios, settlement negotiation strategies, and methods for minimizing wrongful termination exposure. His research had been systematic and focused, suggesting that he had been planning my removal for much longer than anyone had realized. The most troubling part was that he kept asking about ways to question employee integrity or create performance concerns that could justify termination. Patricia continued, when I pressed him about why he needed this information, he became evasive and insisted it was just general policy planning. Patricia's account painted a picture of a man who had become obsessed with perceived risks and had been willing to destroy valuable employee relationships to address threats that existed primarily in his own imagination. His fear of regulatory exposure had overwhelmed his business judgment and led him to take actions that ultimately caused far more damage than any theoretical compliance issues ever could have. But the most disturbing revelation came when Patricia shared the contents of a conversation she had overheard between Richard and Stephanie about my departure. He told her that removing you was necessary to protect the family business from regulatory scrutiny that could have destroyed everything they had worked to build, Patricia reported. Richard had apparently convinced himself that my continued employment represented an existential threat to Pinnacle's future, and he had communicated this belief to his daughter as justification for the succession plan. Stephanie's confidence in replacing me had been based on her father's assurance that my departure was essential for the company's survival rather than simply convenient for her advancement. This context helped explain Stephanie's behavior during the transition period and her apparent shock when clients began departing. She had been told that I was a liability rather than an asset, and she had expected client relationships to improve rather than deteriorate after my removal. The realization that Stephanie had been misled about the situation almost made me feel sorry for her. She had been placed in an impossible position based on her father's flawed understanding of regulatory risks, and she had suffered professional embarrassment as a result of decisions she hadn't fully understood. Armed with this new understanding of Richard's motivations, I found myself reconsidering many aspects of our final confrontations. His defensiveness, his refusal to explain his reasoning, and his apparent desperation to justify his actions all made sense in the context of a man who knew he had made a serious mistake but was too proud to admit it. The anonymous letter that had started this investigation had been accurate about one crucial point: Richard's actions had been driven by fear rather than rational business planning. His discovery of irrelevant background information had triggered a panic response that led him to make increasingly irrational decisions in pursuit of eliminating a threat that didn't actually exist. More importantly, I now understood why the settlement negotiations had proceeded so favorably for my position. Richard's attorneys had quickly recognized that his actions were legally indefensible because they were based on faulty premises and emotional reactions rather than legitimate business concerns. The evidence destruction, the evasive explanations, and the general atmosphere of panic that had characterized Richard's behavior during the legal proceedings all stemmed from his realization that he had created a crisis through his own misunderstanding and poor judgment. But understanding Richard's motivations didn't change the fundamental reality of what had occurred. Regardless of his fears or misinterpretations, he had chosen to act unilaterally rather than communicate his concerns openly. He had damaged valuable client relationships, created unnecessary legal exposure, and undermined the trust that had been essential to Pinnacle's success. The knowledge that his actions had been driven by irrational fears rather than strategic thinking actually made his behavior seem worse rather than better. A leader who makes bad decisions based on accurate information can learn from mistakes, but a leader who makes destructive decisions based on imaginary threats poses a much more serious risk to any organization. As I reflected on this new information, I realized that the anonymous letter had been a gift that provided closure I hadn't even known I needed. Understanding Richard's true motivations allowed me to move forward without wondering what I might have done differently, or whether I had somehow contributed to the conflict through my own actions. The truth was that Richard's behavior had been entirely about his own fears and limitations rather than any real issues with my performance, integrity, or value to the company. The regulatory concerns that had driven his decision-making had been imaginary, and the succession plan that had seemed so sudden and inexplicable had actually been the product of months of paranoid planning. But the most satisfying aspect of this revelation was recognizing how completely Richard's strategy had backfired. His attempt to eliminate a perceived regulatory risk had resulted in actual legal liability, massive financial exposure, and reputational damage that far exceeded anything the imaginary FTC concerns could ever have caused. The company he had tried to protect through my removal was now struggling financially, had lost its competitive advantages, and faced an uncertain future under leadership that lacked the experience and relationships necessary for sustained success.
His fear of theoretical regulatory scrutiny had led him to take actions that created very real business problems with measurable consequences. Meanwhile, Rodriguez Marketing Solutions continued to thrive based on exactly the kind of ethical practices and client relationships that Richard had convinced himself were somehow risky. The regulatory compliance that had so concerned him was actually one of our strongest competitive advantages, and the integrity he had questioned had become a cornerstone of our marketing strategy. The clients who had followed me to the new agency frequently mentioned their confidence in our ethical standards and transparent business practices. The very qualities that Richard had seen as potential liabilities had become the foundation for building something better than what we had left behind at Pinnacle. As I filed away the documents that Daniel Foster had provided and prepared to close this chapter of investigation into Richard's motivations, I couldn't help but appreciate the complete irony of the situation. His attempt to protect his business from imaginary regulatory risks had led him to violate actual employment laws, and his fear of potential FTC scrutiny had resulted in behavior that could have attracted genuine regulatory attention if it had been reported. The lesson was clear: fear-based decision-making rarely produces positive outcomes, especially when those fears are based on misunderstanding rather than real threats. Richard's panic about theoretical compliance issues had led him to take actions that created actual legal problems, and his secretive approach to managing perceived risks had eliminated any possibility of finding reasonable solutions to imaginary problems. But more than just a cautionary tale about poor leadership, this experience had demonstrated the importance of building business relationships based on trust, transparency, and genuine value creation rather than fear and control. The success of Rodriguez Marketing Solutions proved that ethical practices and open communication were competitive advantages rather than regulatory risks. The anonymous letter writer, whoever they were, had been right about one crucial point: I did deserve to know the truth about Richard's motivations. That knowledge didn't change the past, but it provided the understanding necessary to move forward with confidence and clarity about the values that would guide my future business decisions. 2 years later, I was standing in the conference room of Rodriguez Marketing Solutions, looking out at the Denver skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a perfect view of the building where Pinnacle Marketing Solutions used to operate. The irony wasn't lost on me that my new agency had grown large enough to afford premium office space just blocks away from where this entire saga had begun. The conference table was surrounded by 12 employees, each of whom owned equity in the company and had a genuine voice in our strategic decisions. This wasn't the hollow partnership promise that Richard had dangled in front of me for years. It was a real profit-sharing arrangement that aligned everyone's interests with our collective success. "Natalie, the quarterly numbers are exceptional," announced Sarah Martinez, our chief financial officer and one of the first people I'd hired after the settlement. "We're tracking 28% growth over last year, and our client retention rate is 96%, which is virtually unheard of in this industry." The financial success was gratifying, but what I valued most was the culture we'd built together. Every employee understood their contribution to our achievements, every client relationship was managed with integrity and transparency, and every strategic decision was made with long-term thinking rather than short-term panic. Rodriguez Marketing Solutions had become everything I'd hoped Pinnacle could have been if Richard had possessed the wisdom to embrace partnership rather than control.
We handled clients worth over $35 million annually, employed 43 people, and had earned recognition as one of Colorado's fastest-growing businesses for 2 consecutive years. But the most satisfying measure of our success was the quality of work we produced and the impact we had on our clients' businesses. Morrison Automotive Group had expanded into 6 new markets using strategies we'd developed together, and their brand recognition had increased by over 200% since leaving Pinnacle. Similar success stories existed across our entire client portfolio. The meeting that morning was interrupted by my assistant announcing that someone from Pinnacle Marketing Solutions was requesting an urgent appointment to discuss strategic collaboration opportunities. The request was so unexpected that I initially assumed it was some kind of mistake or miscommunication. Did they provide any details about what kind of collaboration they have in mind? I asked, genuinely puzzled by why Pinnacle would be reaching out after 2 years of complete silence. The caller identified himself as Richard Blackwood, and he specifically asked if you would be willing to meet with him privately to discuss a business proposition that could benefit both agencies, my assistant explained, her tone suggesting she was as surprised by the request as I was. The idea of meeting with Richard after everything that had transpired seemed surreal, but my curiosity about his motivations outweighed any lingering resentment about our past conflicts. If he was reaching out now, something significant must have changed in his circumstances or perspective. I agreed to meet with Richard the following week, partly because I wanted to understand what had prompted his contact, and partly because I believed that closure sometimes required facing the past directly rather than simply moving beyond it. When Richard arrived at my office, the change in his appearance was immediately striking. The confident businessman who had dismissed my contract claims 2 years earlier now looked genuinely humbled, and his demeanor suggested someone who had learned difficult lessons through painful experience. "Natalie, thank you for agreeing to see me," he began, his voice carrying none of the authority or condescension that had characterized our final conversations at Pinnacle. "I know I have no right to ask for your time, but there are things I need to say that I should have said long ago." Richard's opening words were an apology that was both comprehensive and specific. He acknowledged that his decision to remove me had been based on flawed reasoning, that his secretive approach had been unfair and destructive, and that his attempt to destroy evidence during our legal dispute had been both unethical and counterproductive. "I let fear and pride drive decisions that should have been made with wisdom and transparency," he admitted, looking directly at me with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "I convinced myself that I was protecting the company, but I was actually destroying everything that had made it successful." More importantly, Richard revealed that he had spent considerable time researching the FTC case that had triggered his original panic about regulatory risks. His investigation had confirmed what Morrison's attorneys had told him from the beginning. The case was completely unrelated to my work, and my association with the firm in question was both minimal and irrelevant to any compliance concerns. "I created a crisis where none existed, and then I compounded that mistake by refusing to admit my error," he explained. "By the time I realized how wrong I'd been, the damage was already done, and my pride prevented me from taking the actions that might have salvaged our working relationship." Richard's acknowledgement of his mistakes was thorough and seemingly sincere, but I remained curious about what had motivated him to seek this meeting after 2 years of silence. The apology was appreciated, but it didn't explain why he was here now, or what kind of strategic collaboration he had mentioned. "Richard, I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge what happened, but I assume you didn't come here just to apologize," I said, keeping my tone neutral but encouraging him to explain his real purpose. What Richard revealed next was both shocking and oddly predictable. Pinnacle Marketing Solutions was facing serious financial difficulties that threatened its continued operation. The client departures that had begun with my removal had continued steadily, and the company's revenue had declined by over 60% since our legal settlement. "We've been operating at a loss for 8 months, and our remaining clients are questioning whether we can provide the level of service they need," Richard admitted, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had watched his life's work slowly disintegrate. The financial problems were compounded by ongoing legal issues related to client contract violations and employee departures. Several former Pinnacle employees had followed departing clients to other agencies, and the company was facing potential lawsuits from clients who claimed breach of service agreements. Stephanie tried her best, but she eventually realized that inheriting a business is different from earning the right to lead it, Richard continued. "She resigned 6 months ago to pursue an MBA program, and I've been trying to manage operations myself while searching for solutions. Richard's description of Pinnacle's decline was a textbook example of how poor leadership decisions can create cascading failures that ultimately destroy even successful organizations. His attempt to protect the company through my removal had instead initiated a death spiral that he was apparently unable to reverse. But the most revealing aspect of Richard's explanation was his admission that the regulatory concerns that had motivated my removal had never materialized into actual problems. No government agencies had ever contacted Pinnacle about compliance issues, no clients had ever raised questions about my background, and no business opportunities had been lost due to the imaginary risks he had feared. Every consequence I was trying to avoid by removing you was purely hypothetical, while every problem that resulted from that decision was real and measurable, he acknowledged. I destroyed actual value while chasing imaginary threats. The business proposition that Richard eventually presented was both desperate and oddly flattering. He wanted to explore the possibility of Rodriguez Marketing Solutions acquiring Pinnacle's remaining assets, client contracts, and intellectual property in exchange for consulting payments that would allow him to exit the business with some financial dignity intact. I know it's presumptuous to ask, but you've built something here that represents everything Pinnacle should have become, he said, gesturing around my conference room. Maybe there's a way for my mistakes to at least contribute to your continued success. The acquisition proposal was interesting from a business perspective because Pinnacle still retains some valuable client relationships and proprietary methodologies that could complement our existing capabilities. However, the emotional complexity of acquiring my former employer's assets required careful consideration of both financial and personal factors. I told Richard that I would need time to evaluate his proposal with my team and advisors, but I appreciated his willingness to approach the situation with honesty, rather than the pride and defensiveness that had characterized his previous decision-making. Over the following week, I discussed the potential acquisition with Sarah Martinez, Caroline Webb, and other trusted advisors who could help me understand both the opportunities and risks involved. The consensus was that Pinnacle's remaining assets could provide value to Rodriguez Marketing Solutions, but only if the acquisition could be structured to avoid inheriting any of the legal or financial liabilities that Richard had created. The due diligence process revealed the full extent of Pinnacle's decline since my departure. Revenue had fallen from over $15 million annually to less than $6 million, employee turnover had exceeded 70%, and client satisfaction scores had dropped to levels that threatened the viability of remaining relationships. More troubling was the discovery that Richard had been borrowing against the company's assets to cover operating expenses, creating debt obligations that significantly reduced the value of any potential acquisition. His desperation to maintain operations had led him to make financial decisions that further compromised Pinnacle's future prospects. However, the due diligence also revealed some genuine opportunities that could benefit Rodriguez Marketing Solutions. Pinnacle retained contracts with 3 clients that represented over $2 million in annual billings, and the company had developed some innovative digital marketing tools that could enhance our service offerings. After extensive analysis and negotiation, we structured an acquisition that allowed Rodriguez Marketing Solutions to purchase Pinnacle's valuable assets while leaving Richard responsible for existing liabilities and debt obligations. The transaction provided him with enough capital to close the business gracefully, while giving us access to resources that could accelerate our growth. The most symbolic aspect of the acquisition was our decision to offer employment opportunities to Pinnacle's remaining staff members who met our standards for competence and cultural fit. Several talented employees who had been trapped in a declining organization were able to transition into an environment where their contributions would be valued and rewarded. Marcus Thompson, the former financial controller who had been one of my closest colleagues at Pinnacle, joined Rodriguez Marketing Solutions as our Director of Business Operations. His institutional knowledge and analytical skills proved invaluable in integrating the acquired assets and optimizing our expanded service capabilities. Natalie, it's remarkable to see how different this place feels compared to Pinnacle during those final months, Marcus observed during his first week with our company. The trust and collaboration here remind me of what Pinnacle used to be like before fear and politics took over. The successful integration of Pinnacle's assets into Rodriguez Marketing Solutions marked the completion of a transformation that had begun with my wrongful termination 2 years earlier. What Richard had intended as my professional downfall had instead become the foundation for building something far more successful than what we had left behind. But the most satisfying outcome wasn't financial or professional. It was the vindication of the values and principles that Richard had abandoned in favor of fear-based decision-making. The company we had built together proved that ethical practices, transparent communication, and genuine partnership could create sustainable competitive advantages in a challenging industry. 6 months after the acquisition, Rodriguez Marketing Solutions was handling clients worth over $40 million annually and had expanded our staff to 63 employees across 2 office locations. The growth was sustainable because it was built on genuine value creation rather than financial engineering or market manipulation. The former Pinnacle clients who had joined our portfolio were consistently exceeding their performance expectations, and several had referred new business to us based on their satisfaction with our service delivery. The trust and results that Richard had feared losing through regulatory concerns were actually enhanced by our commitment to ethical practices and compliance excellence. More importantly, the workplace culture we had established was attracting top talent from across the industry. Experienced professionals were leaving established agencies to join our team because they valued the equity participation, collaborative decision-making, and long-term thinking that characterized our approach to business development. The contrast with Pinnacle's final months was stark and instructive. Where Richard had created an atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and political maneuvering, we had built an environment based on trust, transparency, and shared success. The difference in outcomes demonstrated that leadership philosophy ultimately determines organizational performance more than market conditions or competitive factors. 1 year after the acquisition, I received a letter from Richard thanking me for handling the transaction with fairness and professionalism, despite our contentious history. He had used the proceeds from the sale to pay off his debts and was considering opportunities in business consulting, where his experience with both success and failure might provide value to other entrepreneurs. "Watching what you've built has taught me more about leadership than 20 years of running my own company," he wrote. "I hope other business owners can learn from my mistakes without having to experience the consequences firsthand." Richard's letter included an admission that was both humbling and enlightening. He revealed that the anonymous note I had received about his true motivations had actually been sent by Patricia Kim, who had felt that I deserved to understand the full context of his decision-making process. Patricia had apparently struggled with whether to reveal Richard's irrational fears about regulatory exposure, but she had ultimately decided that truth was more important than protecting his reputation. Her decision to send that information anonymously had provided the closure I needed while allowing her to maintain her professional integrity. The revelation that Patricia had been the anonymous letter writer made perfect sense in retrospect. She had possessed the inside knowledge necessary to understand Richard's motivations, the professional ethics to recognize that his behavior had been wrong, and the personal courage to ensure that I learned the truth even when it might have negative consequences for her former employer. As I reflected on the complete arc of this experience, from my initial removal from Pinnacle to the successful acquisition of its assets, I was struck by how completely the situation had reversed from Richard's original intentions. His attempt to eliminate me as a perceived liability had instead positioned me to acquire his company when it became an actual liability. The regulatory risks he had feared never materialized, while the business risks he created through his decision-making had systematically destroyed everything he had worked to build. His fear of imaginary government scrutiny had led him to take actions that resulted in real legal consequences, financial losses, and reputational damage. More fundamentally, Richard's story served as a cautionary tale about the importance of making decisions based on facts rather than fears, consulting with affected parties rather than acting unilaterally, and maintaining the courage to admit mistakes rather than compounding them through pride and defensiveness. The success of Rodriguez Marketing Solutions demonstrated that the principles Richard had abandoned, ethical practices, transparent communication, and genuine partnership, were actually the foundation of sustainable competitive advantage in professional services. The values he had seen as potential liabilities had become our greatest strengths. But perhaps the most important lesson from this entire experience was the recognition that crisis often creates opportunity for those who are prepared to respond with wisdom rather than panic. Richard's poor decision-making had created the circumstances that allowed me to build something better than what I had lost, and his eventual recognition of his mistakes had enabled a resolution that benefited everyone involved. Today, Rodriguez Marketing Solutions continues to grow and prosper based on the principles that guided our founding, treating employees as genuine partners, serving clients with integrity and excellence, and making decisions based on long-term value creation rather than short-term fear management. The company represents everything I had hoped Pinnacle could become if Richard had possessed the wisdom to embrace collaboration rather than control. The office building where this story began now houses a struggling real estate firm that took over Pinnacle's former space after the acquisition. Sometimes when I drive past it on my way to work, I'm reminded of how different things could have been if Richard had chosen to address his concerns through conversation rather than conspiracy, transparency rather than secrecy, and partnership rather than replacement. The greatest irony is that the partnership appreciation clause that provided the foundation for my legal settlement had been Richard's own idea, designed to ensure my loyalty to Pinnacle by giving me a financial stake in its success. When that loyalty was tested through his actions, the clause worked exactly as designed, just not in the way he had expected. His attempt to protect his family's inheritance by removing me had instead funded my ability to build a competing business that ultimately acquired his company's assets. The daughter he had tried to elevate had discovered that leadership must be earned rather than inherited, and the employee he had tried to eliminate had become the business owner who determined his exit strategy. But more than personal vindication or financial success, this experience validated the belief that ethical business practices and authentic professional relationships create value that cannot be easily replicated or replaced. The trust that Richard had been willing to sacrifice in pursuit of eliminating imaginary risks had proven to be the most valuable asset any professional services firm could possess. The clients who followed me to Rodriguez Marketing Solutions, the employees who chose to join our team, and the industry recognition we earned all stemmed from relationships built on competence, integrity, and mutual respect rather than fear, control, and political maneuvering. Richard's final email to me, sent 6 months after our transaction closed, contained an observation that captured the essence of what he had learned through this painful experience. True security in business comes from creating genuine value for clients and employees, not from trying to control every possible risk or outcome. I wish I had understood that truth before it was too late to apply it at Pinnacle. His recognition of this fundamental principle came too late to save his company, but perhaps it wasn't too late to influence how other business leaders approach the challenges of succession planning, risk management, and employee relations. The story of Pinnacle's decline and Rodriguez Marketing Solutions' success serves as a case study in how leadership philosophy ultimately determines organizational outcomes. As I continue to build and expand Rodriguez Marketing Solutions, I remain committed to the values that guided us through this challenging period and that continue to drive our success. Every employee agreement includes genuine profit-sharing provisions. Every client relationship is managed with transparency and integrity, and every strategic decision is made with long-term thinking rather than short-term fear. The partnership that Richard had promised but never delivered has become the foundation of everything we've accomplished. The trust he had been willing to sacrifice has become our most valuable competitive advantage, and the regulatory compliance he had feared has become a cornerstone of our reputation in the marketplace. Sometimes the best revenge against those who underestimate us isn't revenge at all. It's simply building something so successful and admirable that their poor judgment becomes obvious to everyone who knows the story. Richard's attempt to diminish my value only highlighted it, and his fear of imaginary risks created real opportunities for those prepared to seize them. The contract clause that seemed like such a minor detail when I signed it 15 years ago had become the foundation for everything that followed. Richard's insistence on including partnership appreciation language to ensure my loyalty had created the very mechanism that enabled my independence when that loyalty was no longer valued. His forgotten contract had indeed become his worst nightmare, but not because of any malicious intent on my part. It had simply worked exactly as designed, protecting the interests of someone who had contributed genuine value to a business relationship when that relationship was unilaterally terminated by fear rather than wisdom. The boy who had packed my office that day 2 years ago had asked if I was sure I didn't want to take the plants with me. At the time I had said I wouldn't need them where I was going. Looking back now, I realized that was more accurate than I knew. I wasn't just leaving Pinnacle behind, I was growing into something bigger and better than anything those office plants could have symbolized. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.